Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way. Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
You are watching Breakthrough News, and this is the Freedom Side. I am one of your intrepid co-hosts, Eugene and here alongside my colleague, Rania Khalek. Rania, as always, good to be back alongside you.
It's great to be back alongside you, Eugene. Such a great show we have today.
It was a great show. It is a great show that we have. I don't know why I said
Wow.
was. Well, we had a great show past, 3 years that we've been doing this show or whatever. So nonetheless, it was a great show whenever that was, but it is a great show coming up for you here today. Big shout out to everyone who is joining us. And for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, great opportunity now for you to go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Then hit the bell so that you can get the alerts for the things that you subscribe to, so you can get easy access to all the fantastic content that we have here on Breakthrough News, including Dispatches with Rania Khalek. And for those of you who are watching us here this evening on Free Speech TV, big shout out to you. You don't have to do anything but keep watching and keep supporting Free Speech TV. And shout out to the whole FSTV team for allowing us to appear to you via their fantastic platform. Rania, are there other elements you would like to bring in for our audience here as we start the show?
Yes, I want to remind everybody who's watching to first and foremost, smash that like button. It helps boost us in the algorithm because we're not CNN. Oh, wow. Okay, what's going on, Matt? What was that? What was that?
Smash that like button.
Why did you shout out Matt? It's not even Matt.
Oh, John. Wow. I'm so sorry. I forgot it's John. John's
It's okay.
back there.
I mean, shout out to Matt in general, but yeah.
Shout out to Matt, but I bet John appreciated the fact that I just blamed Matt for something he did.
Yeah.
But he ultimately got it. Smash that like button. There it is. There it is. One of these days, we're not going to fumble the beginning. I can't wait for that day to come. But today is not that day. But back to where I was going with
you
this.
say we, but...
Hey, you did it too, Eugene. Don't put this just on me and John. It was a team fumble. It was a team fumble.
It's one way to look at it.
Listen, if you want us to not fumble the beginning, you should become a supporter of Breakthrough News. Go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News and become a member of Breakthrough News. But in all seriousness, we are living in an era of just constant lies, a tsunami of propaganda. I just experienced it in Venezuela while on the ground, watching one reality take place, the real one, and then watching a weird, distorted version of it come out at the New York Times and CNN and all these other mainstream corporate media outlets that we're going to talk about on this show today. We've watched them lie about Gaza and Lebanon and the Middle East in general as Israel carries out a genocide that it's trying to spread and escalate. And here at Breakthrough News, we tell the truth about that, which is why you should become a member at patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Help us grow, help us thrive, so we can keep bringing you the reality that's happening on the ground from the Middle East to Latin America and beyond. You can also donate in the live chat, and you can go to breakthroughnews.org for one-time donations.
Excellent. Well, that was very smooth. Good execution. You scooped up the fumble and you ran with it. That's an American football reference there for those who don't know. High school students getting ready to start your high school football practice. Shout out to you. Don't fumble the ball when you're out there in two-a-days. But yes, that is correct. We could absolutely use your support. Big shout out, by the way, to all of our existing patrons. Everything you've done so far has been truly monumental in allowing us to get to an even higher level. And big shout out to all our viewers. Even, we know it's tough times for those who aren't able to become financial supporters. Everything you do to spread the word about what we have going on here at Breakthrough News is also greatly appreciated. So got a lot for you here on the show, as we always do. We'll be talking Middle East. We'll be talking about Africa. We'll be talking about Venezuela. We'll be talking about political prisoners in India. We'll be talking about police terrorism here in the United States. And we'll end up with a little commentary from Rania and myself about several of the important events that are going on around the world and the implications from them. So however you choose to do so, now would be a great time to let folks know that we are here on the freedom side, whether you want to Shout it out, knock on a door, air horn, carrier pigeon, whatever seems right. Let them know, because we want whoever is following you to be following us as we get started here on the Freedom Side on August 1st, 2024. So we want to, I think, go ahead, Rania, and get right into it. And obviously, one of the biggest issues that is facing the globe right now that everyone is talking about is the possibility of continued escalation by Israel into Lebanon, the possibility that they may invade and do various other things in order to increase the level of violence they are imposing on the people of Lebanon. And we are very, very honored to be joined here on the show as we move forward by Ghadi Francis, who's a war correspondent based in Lebanon. Ghadi, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me, Eugene. Such a pleasure to be in the middle between you and Rania.
Well, believe me, it is also our pleasure to have you here with us. And I guess, just to start here, I mean, it really, I don't want to have too many projections because you never know exactly what's happening, but it really does feel that Israel, sort of step by step is laying the basis to keep increasing almost terroristic-like activity on Lebanon. And from your perspective, I mean, I wonder how you are interpreting this in terms of what their goals may be, and if you think it's leading to something further, or really just trying to save face in the midst of what Hezbollah has been able to do in defense and in relationship to what's happening in Gaza.
Well, first of all, Eugene, when someone crazy is having a tantrum, you don't really look at what are they trying to do. This is a genocidal, ethnic cleansing, apartheid state occupation that has been carrying out a massacre, a televised genocide for the past 9 months. So they're not really very sane when we're looking at the situation here. I'm always feeling better and more secure when the ball is in the hands of the resistance, like it is right now, because it has been a tit for tat exchange for the past 9 months, especially on the Lebanese front. A target for a target, a kill for a kill, a base for a base, and the resistance has been able to play this, to orchestrate this kind of deterrence and retaliation in a way that would always preserve and protect the Lebanese infrastructure. And the complex political situation of Lebanon does not really help in opening a full-blown war as well. So right now, after the assassination of Fuad Shukr, they are waiting for Hezbollah's retaliation. And when the Israelis are waiting for the retaliation, because I trust the wisdom of Hezbollah and their retaliation and their strikes, we feel at ease because we know that they will have it calculated in a way. When you ask me why the Israelis are doing that, are they trying really to collect some wins or to save face? I think yes. I think they're trying, especially Benjamin Netanyahu is trying like tactical wins, which really are not wins if you go to dissect these events. I mean, Ismail Haniyeh is not the first. He's just another Hamas leader that has been assassinated. His predecessors were all assassinated. When you look at Fuad Shukr and Hezbollah, his colleagues and fellows have been assassinated in the same manner. The leaders of the resistance are made for martyrdom. They calculate this martyrdom. They put it in front of their eyes. Their families know it. Their lifestyles are always governed in a way where this is a daily possibility in their lives. So when you look at Fuad Shukr, you say he lived 40 years after the Israelis were trying to kill him. 40 years, every day and night, the Israelis were trying to kill this man that was able to expand the warfare technology for the resistance, to expand missiles and ways in fighting the Israelis for years and years. He was there in every fight. He's been in the leadership of the Al-Aqsa flood operations and also the operations before. So this is not really a win for Israel. These people are martyrs in the waiting. It's actually putting the ball once again in the hands or in the control of the resistance axis. They can choose how, when, and what kind of retaliation to carry on. And And I think the coming days will show the world how wise, when you say non-state actors, and some of the media calls them militias, and you look at how wise and how much they are caring for the civilian life and the civilian cost, and the way they are governing their retaliatory strikes. I mean, these non-state actors that are called militias and are called the resistance axis in this part of the world have really proven to be more respectable. More, they respect the international law, although they are occupied and they have every right to do everything they want, but they play more reasonably and more wisely and strongly and faithfully than the colonizing occupation apartheid regime.
Ghadi, I'm sure you saw that Hassan Nasrallah spoke today, and he made a point that you just touched on about the fact that the Israelis continue to assassinate resistance leaders, and it doesn't change anything. In fact, it makes these organizations more powerful. And he also made the point, he said that we have entered a new stage of this war, where before a lot of these fronts, whether Lebanon or Yemen or Iraq, were supportive fronts for Gaza, but now he called them battle fronts in their own right, especially because the Israelis are directly crossing red lines. They've been targeting Lebanon. They actually targeted Yemen. They bombed Yemen last week, I believe it was. And we're now at a new dangerous phase. I'm just curious, as somebody, you've been to Iraq, you've covered Yemen, you've been to Yemen, you've been to the tunnels of Gaza, you have obviously been all across Lebanon, you've been all across Syria. When we watch this battle that's played out from October till now, do you see this as a new phase in this war? And I'm talking here about beyond Palestine.
Well, and also Iran. I've been to Iran. Being all in all these countries, I think from the beginning, regardless of the nomenclature or the designation of the war, the Israelis and the Americans regard all these entities as one, and they impose sanctions. They demonize them. They character assassinate their politicians and their leaders, and they pay billions of dollars to fight them every time there is any kind of elections, whether it's presidential or parliamentary. I'm talking about Iraq, Lebanon, and all these countries. So I think the new era that Sayyid Nasrallah has announced, when these are all battlefields, it has been like that, but it hasn't been really declared as such in the past. And probably it's also because of the wisdom of the resistance axis and how they're playing out this war. But now the Israelis and the Americans, they have called them battlefields. They have touched the beasts, and this is why, in terms of the historical events and days that we are living, we are witnessing the end of Israel. I mean, whether you see that or not, in the future, our grandkids will look at these times as the last days of Israel, because you cannot carry on a massacre and televise it and post it on TikTok and get away with it. It's not going to happen. We will always know that one of the main reasons why Israel is ending is that all of the Levant, all of Surakia, all of Greater Syria, all the people have been antagonized and killed enough and slaughtered enough to gain one faith in fighting this oppression. I really think we are going to witness a new season of this war, but I don't think it's going to be a full-blown operation. Not in Lebanon, not in Iraq, not in any of. And by the way, Rania, you've been covering this region for the past few years as well, and just like I know, if it's assassinations, it hadn't stopped before. They assassinated people before October 7th. I mean, leaders and so on, whether it's Iranians, Lebanese, Palestinians in Syria and Lebanon and Iran. Okay, in Iraq as well, the Americans have been doing this on and off for the past decade or more. Syria as well. So when they talk about an escalation, I mean, there wasn't peace here. It's just your way of covering it was different. Do we really forget what they did in Iraq? Do you really forget who they assassinated in Baghdad International Airport? There was no October 7th, but they did something very similar to what they did to Ismail Haniyeh. I mean, in terms of the politics and the policy. This war has been going on in this region for 76 years plus. The ways and the shapes and the manifestations of the war differ and alter. with the times. But this only makes us feel more comfortable and more optimistic about the future, because it's the wish. It has been a wish for the Palestinians to see the Iraqis and the Syrians and the Lebanese and the Yemenis involved in their struggle. Had that been the case since 1948, Palestine would have been liberated long time ago.
You know, I think one of the factors that is important, I think, especially for people watching in the United States about how this is portrayed, especially sort of the various resistance fronts is, and you know, because you read the American media, it's like Lebanon has been hijacked by Hezbollah, Gaza has been hijacked by Hamas, and all the people really would reject these organizations if they weren't, you know, funded by the evil Iranian, you know, terrorist regime. So I was hoping you could also talk a little bit about that aspect, is, you know, how the people of Lebanon and in these other places feel about the resistance forces, because, you know, maybe it seems obvious to some people, but it's obviously going to be impossible to sustain yourself if you don't have popular support.
I think it is time for the American media and the American politicians to stop saying lies and believing them, because even the American people do not believe them anymore. I mean, you can say this lie, you can say the same lie a million years, it's not going to change. Hezbollah is a part of the parliament. How could they hijack if they have the most voted parliamentary members ever in the history of Lebanon? 50,000 plus Muhammad Raad got. They have their supporters are Lebanese, their fighters and their martyrs are Lebanese. You cannot call white black or blue green and just believe it. And it's very obvious that Hezbollah is a part of the Lebanese social structure. It is very obvious that it is part of the political structure. And if they do not acknowledge the reality and they always think of them as aliens who hijack, they will never be able to fight them. They will never be able to change the policies or to make them less loved among their people. If you do not really know your enemy very well, you will never be able to fight them. One of their biggest failures, when I'm speaking about the anti-Hezbollah states and actors and people and politicians, one of their biggest failures comes from them denying the facts. They don't want to see the fact. Whether you say, I mean, even the Israelis, one of their ministers was on TV saying, oh, they have Katyusha. I mean, Rania made me listen to that lunatic on the dispatches earlier. And he's saying, oh, they have Katyushas, what can they do? He can say we only have Katyushas all day, all night. But the missiles are getting there. Their headquarters are being evacuated. Our drone footage is getting out there in the whole wide world. So the lies do not work anymore. Hezbollah is a part of the Lebanese structure. And before Hezbollah was born, there was another armed resistance group that was a part of the Lebanese structure. The action here that started all of these non-state actors and they were all legalized by their people and loved and revered by their people because they emerged as their protectors. They were protecting them from the ongoing slaughter that has started with the Haganah 1948 and haven't stopped with the neo-Haganas and the neo-Nazis in 2024. We are seeing what they are doing. So this has been ongoing for all this period of time. The people in Lebanon, the people in Palestine, any oppressed or occupied people would revere their resistance groups as protectors. Right now, even the people who are against Hezbollah, right now, if Beirut is under attack and Hezbollah is actually fighting back and protecting Lebanon, every single Lebanese person will be praying for them because our well-being is part of their well-being as well. So American media and mainstream media and politicians keep telling you these things, keep telling you that all Islam are terrorists and these are Islamic group. But I mean, you are more aware than that. You have seen how they treat Islamophobics who kill children in the American community. I think the real terrorism today is the bias and is the absence of accountability towards these crimes that are happening. Some of them we're not even knowing about. So the era of listening to what the American mainstream media is saying, I think it's done. I think all the world, nobody believes them anymore. Not even the American people and the American youth, as we could see from the college encampments. I mean, I think the truth is out there and they cannot really serve in denying facts anymore.
Yeah, it's really incredible. There's just one last thing I wanted to touch on, Ghadi, before we let you go here, and that's the fact. Speaking of lies, I noticed that after I wasn't in Lebanon when the killings of those children on the soccer field in the occupied Golan Heights took place, and Hezbollah vehemently denied that they were involved in it. The Israelis, of course, blamed Hezbollah. Hezbollah said this was like an errant Iron Dome missile. I'm just curious, what was the sentiment in Lebanon about that in terms of how the media covered it and how people were viewing it? Did anybody buy Israel's side of the story, or was everybody just pretty certain it was likely the Israelis?
I will tell you, it took us split seconds, me and our friend, when we read the news. We looked at each other, and Hezbollah doesn't kill civilians. It took split second. We look at each other, say, we all know Hezbollah doesn't kill civilians. But then the coming minute, we all know that Golan is Syrian. We all know that the Israelis hate Arabs, even the Israeli Arabs. I mean, there's no way that any sane mind could believe that lie. And they want to retaliate for Durzi kids. They really like them so much. Then why did they deny them any papers? Today, does anyone know how how's the livelihood of the people in Majd al-Shams in occupied Golan Heights? Does anybody know before they go and carry the Israeli claim? These are not Israeli kids. These are Syrian people who denied Israeli papers, who are paying for it right now. They are lost and stranded in the middle of nowhere. There's Syrian government that cannot access them very well, and there's the occupation. And even if you really had some question and you don't want to believe all of that, you can look at what the people did when Benjamin Netanyahu tried to visit them and tried to pay condolences. They spoke. They kicked him out.
They did indeed, and also Basil Smotrich, so it does say a lot. And certainly, we really appreciate the opportunity, Ghadi, for you to join us here and help us sort through all of this. I know you're very busy, so thank you for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me, guys.
Rania?
Well, Ghadi's excellent. I encourage anybody who is, for whatever reason, not following her to go follow her on Twitter, on Instagram. She's always doing excellent interviews, and her analysis is so on point and important. She's such an important voice coming out of the Middle East. And I have had her on Dispatches twice since October 7th. So I encourage you to go check out those episodes as well.
Yeah, 100%. Great episodes both times. Well, we want to turn our attention now to the West African nation of Nigeria. For those who have not been seeing, a wave of protest has swept Nigeria today, perhaps a wave of more protest over the coming days under the hashtag #InBadGovernance and also Revolution Now. So a lot happening in Nigeria, and we are very, very honored to have here on the show to talk about this by David Hundeyin, who's a Nigerian investigative journalist and author. David, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, it's great to have you here. And let me just start maybe with some framing. Perhaps people saw some photos of protests coming out, but what are sort of the proximate issues that have ignited this protest wave there in Nigeria?
So there are multiple issues. There's sort of multiple subgroups that have sort of coalesced into a bigger protest movement. But the basic underlying issue that seems to unify everyone is the understanding that Nigeria is going through an unprecedented crisis of bad economics, basically. To put it in context, as at 2014, 10 years ago, Nigeria was rated as Africa's largest economy with a GDP of about $510 billion. 10 years later, Nigeria's population has increased, but Nigeria's GDP now stands at about $280 billion. So Nigeria's GDP has effectively halved in 10 years, while its population has gone up. So Nigeria's per capita income has more than halved in the space of 10 years. Already, it wasn't a particularly wealthy country in per capita terms, but now it's at disastrous levels. To put it in further context, of Nigeria's estimated 210 million people, about 135 million are estimated to be living in multi-dimensional poverty. which is about 65% of the country's population. So to put that in context, there is no other African country which has a population of up to 135 million. So that 135 million of Nigerians who are living in multidimensional poverty, that in itself is a population segment that is bigger than any other African country. So there is a huge groundswell of public anger to tap from. This is then further complicated by the fact that the new government, which came into power last year, which, as you may or may not know, is very much a US backed government, has made absolutely no attempt whatsoever, as far as it is possible to tell, to create any sort of dent in this sort of ongoing economic disaster going on. And in fact, it is very much the case that the presidency and the executive arm of government seems even more determined to act as if the good times are rolling. So one of the stories that has caused a lot of controversy this year has been the decision of the president to buy a new presidential jet. To put that in perspective, the Nigerian presidency already has the largest presidential jet fleet in Africa. Has a larger presidential jet fleet than many European countries. Bear in mind, this is a country with a per capita GDP, per capita income of roughly $1,500 a year, right? And at a time when there was a huge public finance crisis, an estimated uh, roughly 80 to 87 cents of every dollar made by Nigeria is going on debt servicing, debt repayments, right? And at the time of austerity measures, because as you know, Nigeria has also had to approach the IMF and the World Bank multiple times, and the Nigerian naira, that's the currency, has roughly halved in the space of a year in terms of its value against the US dollar. So about a year ago, it was roughly about 800 naira to a dollar. Now it's about 1,500 naira to a dollar. And in the space of all of this, the president announces that his priority is to get a new Airbus private jets. The country then spends another 21 billion naira on a new residence for the vice president, who wasn't exactly homeless to begin with. So it then becomes clear to the people that it almost seems as if the government and the governed are living on two different planets, because on the ground people are suffering in a very, very real, very, very visceral way, suffering to the extent that even food, like actual nutrition, has become a problem. And something like 65% of Nigerian household income now goes on food alone, right? So that should give you an idea of just how serious this problem is. Like, this is not a hypothetical numbers problem. This is a very real problem. People are literally holding banners saying we are hungry. That's not a cute expression of discontent. That's a literal statement of fact. People are functionally malnourished because of how bad the economy is right now. And yet you have this sort of great big cavernous government which sort of sits at a great height and almost seems as if it lives on a different planet to the rest of the country. So these are just some of the issues.
Wow. I mean, it's really important to understand all that context, given the fact that this is a very close ally of the US, this government in Nigeria, and is often touted as the way that an African country should be. And I'm just curious, when we talk about what's happening in Nigeria, what has there been, I should ask it this way, has there been any perhaps influence or inspiration taken in what's been happening in the Sahel over the last year or so, with all these different movements pushing out, and new governments rising, pushing out the French and the Americans, and basically trying to impose their own sovereignty on their countries. And obviously Nigeria has been used by the US to kind of push back against that. But has any of those changes across West Africa influenced people's views about what they're able to perhaps do in their own country of Nigeria?
Absolutely, absolutely have. So specifically, the coup which happened last year in Niger, which is Nigeria's immediate northern neighbor, has had a definite impact, because I think prior to that coup, most Nigerians sort of thought of Niger as this sort of 37th state of Nigeria, not a very significant country in the eyes of most Nigerians. didn't really understand how it was even a strategically important country in geopolitical terms. And then the coup happened, and the flurry of international attention that came with it. And then, more importantly, the fact that afterward, Nigeria has since become Africa's top performing economy in the space of in a situation where it ordinarily is expected to be in chaos. It's doing 11% economic growth, which that's the sort of economic growth numbers Nigeria hasn't seen since maybe the 1970s during the oil boom, right? So that is then sort of creating a lot of questions and challenging a lot of assumptions, because some of the sort of successfully promoted assumptions in the Nigerian public space are that um, democracy, in the sense that it is promoted by the U.S. embassy, basically is a precondition for economic growth and prosperity. Well, here we have Nigeria, which on paper is a democracy, has all the paraphernalia of a democratic state, has all the institutions on paper, has the Freedom of Information Act, has all the bells and whistles, even though functionally it's Nigeria is actually classified as a hybrid authoritarian state, not a democracy, but it's treated as a democracy, especially by its foreign allies like the US. And people are starting to realize that, hey, these assumptions may not actually be true, because here, look at Niger, who we've never really thought of as consequential in any way. We've never really thought these guys are going anywhere, and all of a sudden they appear to definitely be going somewhere. You simply can't sniff at the fact that this is a country doing 11% annual economic growth. That those numbers are unfathomable to a Nigerian. So that definitely has raised some questions. And then, almost as importantly, the events in Kenya, which have happened or are still happening almost concurrently, have also had a very outsized impact, because in both the cases of Niger and Kenya, even though the manifestations have been different, but ultimately it would seem as if the target of the anger has actually been sort of two sides of the same coin. So in the case of Niger, it's been a sort of direct response to perceived colonial um, interests and activities in the Sahel region. In the case of Kenya, it's been a response to the perceived neo-colonial actions of the IMF. And the fact that the populations of these countries have been able to so successfully, so visually, and so successfully oppose these things and have actually seen some results has created a significant amount of expectation in Nigerian public space that, okay, so if Niger, this sleepy next door neighbor of ours, has been able to do something, bear in mind that in the aftermath of what the things that happened in Niger, as you rightly said, Nigeria was used, or the attempt was made to use Nigeria as a sort of blunt force instrument to bludgeon them back into line. And that simply didn't work. Nigeria imposed some of the harshest sanctions possible for a country to impose on a much economically less powerful neighbor. Nigeria blockaded Niger's borders. Niger is a landlocked country. They didn't have access to the sea. They were effectively cut off from global trade. Nigeria shut off their electricity, which was in violation of international law. Technically, Nigeria committed war crimes, you know, just to sort of bring them back into line. And at the end of the day, all this was to the net effect of absolutely nothing. The Nigerians are basically doing better than they were a year ago, as far as they're concerned, and are doing better than a significant part of the Nigerian population. And then the Kenyans were able to do their own sort of very visually successful um, uh, resistance action. So these factors have sort of very had a very outsized influence on the decision of Nigerians to come out and try to get something done.
I think this is a critically important point here, touching on the sort of geopolitics of it. And I want to, pick up on a point you made at the very beginning here of sort of this being a U.S.-backed government. And I know your own investigative reporting during the election was very much at the tip of the spear of some important factors. And when it seemed like, you correct me if you think I'm wrong here, the U.S. government was trying to help conceal certain information that could have had a significant impact on how Nigerians viewed the election and the vote. So talk, if you could, maybe about that specifically, but just in general, what the United States is hoping to get out of backing the current government of Mr. Tinubu.
So, for those who may not be aware, the current president of Nigeria, who came to power last year in the sort of heavily disputed election, that's the president of Bola Ahmed Tinubu, used to be resident in the US and used to be a drug trafficker in the city of Chicago. He was active between the 1980s and the early 90s, and he was actually identified as a drug trafficker and as a money launderer, working on behalf of a heroin trafficking ring in Chicago by the U.S. government. There was a multi-agency investigation involved in this investigation. So the IRS, the DEA, the FBI, and to a lesser extent, later on, the State Department and the CIA also got involved because shortly after his involvement became clear, it also became he had also started to have some involvement in Nigerian politics. So, from the point of view of the US, rather than simply make this sort of mid-level or mid to high-level drug trafficker, international drug trafficker, pay for his crimes, I guess it was more expedient for the US government to use him for the purpose of international influence peddling, because this is someone who was at the time becoming more active in the Nigerian political space. Bear in mind, the US actually has form for doing things like this. So you recall recently the former president of, I believe it was Honduras, was extradited to the US on charges of drug trafficking. The story that I think is perhaps less told is that during the time when he was active as a drug trafficker or as a president with ties to drug trafficking, he was very much a US ally, and the US was very much aware of what he was doing. It was not a secret to them. You know, they have some of the best intelligence networks on the earth. So there's nothing that was happening that was a secret to them, right? And it was expedient to use him as a pawn, as a tool at the time. And as soon as he was no longer useful, then we got these headlines. So Nigeria is currently pretty much where Honduras was maybe a decade ago, in that it's being ruled by someone who is, for lack of a better term, an American puppet, right? A stooge, because this is someone who has the perfect sort of blackmail material being held on him by the US government. So um, this wasn't entirely hidden at the time, because the results of the IRS, the IRS leg of the investigation, actually had some had some documentation in the public domain, which I was able to get hold of, and with which I was able to establish to a very large degree of certainty that this person who was running for president at the time has been at the very least indicted for heroin trafficking in the US. But then it quickly became very clear that the US government was willing to do incredible things to keep this information hidden. So at the moment, I'm still in court with 6 different US government agencies. So the IRS, the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, and the Executive Office of the US Attorneys. And there have been some incredible things that I have witnessed through the course of this FOIA lawsuit, where I've seen the US government telling lies in court to protect a foreign criminal. I didn't know such things were possible. It's been a real learning process, and as far as it's possible to tell, it's clear that the U.S. government, even from the wording of some of the privacy exceptions which have been used to prevent the release of this information into the public domain, there have been privacy exceptions that have been linked to national security. Somehow, it's in the national security of the U.S. to protect a foreign drug trafficker. Why and how exactly that is the case, I guess the US government is the only one that can answer that question. So basically, that's where Nigeria is right now. Nigeria is being ruled by a foreign criminal of Nigerian descent who has backing, or who at the very least, as recently as last year, had the backing of the US government. And it seems as if, based on that relationship that he has with the with the American authorities, he has been able to consolidate himself in power. And as you may have seen today, the sort of uprising against his very, very blatant misrule by the Nigerian masses has been met with incredible amounts of state violence. Usually, when a protest like this sprouts, it usually doesn't sort of go up in flames on the very first day. But today alone, which is the very first day of the protest, no fewer than 11 people have been killed across the country. It looks like it's only going to get worse. And so far, it seems as if, well, the interests of the US government um, do not really seem to coincide with those of the Nigerian people. So it would seem as if this fight, the Nigerian people are sort of we're in it on our own, basically.
Mm. Well, we will certainly continue to follow it, certainly through West Africa Weekly and your own byline as well. David Hundane, thank you so much for joining us here on The Freedom Side.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, I highly suggest folks check out West Africa Weekly that David helped found in addition to himself. They're following this very, very closely, like minute by minute. So a lot of great updates you can find there about what's happening in Nigeria. I want to keep pushing forward here, Rania. We want to turn to an important topic, and that is ongoing repression of popular struggle and political prisoners in India. And we are very, very honored to be joined here once again by Suchitra Vijayan, who's an author, lawyer, and founder and director of the Polis Project. Suchitra, as always, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, great to have you. No, of course, and great to have you here. How long can the moon be caged? Voices of Indian political prisoners. New text that has been out in the most recent weeks that you helped put together. I want to get into some of what's in the text, but I actually want to start here with a little bit of a framing point, because I think, maybe for the average person, when they think of the term political prisoner, India is not a country that maybe comes to their mind. So maybe if you could just give us some context for the nature of political prisoners there in India.
Sure. I think while putting together this book, I think one thing became very clear to us is that people do not recognize that democracies around the world have political prisoners. United States has its own political prisoners. We have political prisoners right now in the United States. Britain has its political prisoners. Israel, of course, has its own political prisoners. And India, like as I said, all democracies have political prisoners. I think what we really see is that the word political prisoner is often associated with regimes that we think are autocratic and authoritarian, often linked to regimes like Russia and China. But in reality, all democracies have political prisoners. And in this book, we've really looked at political prisoners as anybody who has been arrested or incarcerated purely for their right to dissent and opinions, and sometimes simply just exercising their right to citizenship. In our book, what you really see is that most of the young students, leaders, writers, lawyers picked up, all of them sometimes were not even just, they were not the right to resist and protest doesn't exist with the Indian Constitution. Sometimes they were simply arrested for exercising their citizenship rights. So I think that is the context and the frame in which we have to look at political prisoners in India, but also in democracies around the world.
And I'm curious if you could speak to specifically what's happened in the last decade under Modi in terms of the attack the attack on dissent and what the situation with political prisoners has looked like during the rule of the BJP.
I think one of the things we have to be very clear about is that India's first political prisoners emerged soon after its independence, as early as 1948-49. So political prisoners by itself is not new to India. Political dissent has a long history, and just as political dissent has a history, there's a long history of repression in India. But what you really see within Modi's regime is that what the previous regimes did in the garb of the night, you see this regime doing in the morning. And again, the laws that you see in India, like the UAPA, and then the infrastructure of terror and sedition laws that are used to criminalize dissent, again, have a long history. And we can trace it back. The most recent version of this can be traced back to what happened in the United States after 9/11, where you had the Patriot Act kind of replicated in India with similar laws. So in the last 20 years, what you've really seen is institutionalization of emergency laws within India's constitution, which is now under Modi regime has just kind of become, I think what was already a very bad situation just got worse. And what some of the things that they've done really is today under the India's terror laws, anybody could be unilaterally designated as a terrorist without any proof, and the burden of proof is reversed. Now it's almost impossible for people to get bail. They have completely watered down the right to habeas corpus. So under Modi, things have gotten worse, but we also have to understand that the foundations for these erosion of rights really happened much, much before.
One of the things that I think is interesting about the book, and again, the title is How Long Can the Moon Be Caged, is that it's presenting political prisoners as not inert, like you're just thrown away in prison and people forget you, but also focusing on sort of, the small aspects of people inside, the families outside, where they're really continuing their struggle. And I was hoping you could give us a little window into some of those aspects that the book also reveals.
Absolutely. Two things. I think I want people to know that "How Long Can the Moon Be Caged" actually comes from a letter that Natasha Narwhal, who's one of the young student activists, was arrested. It's a line that comes from the letters that she wrote in prison. So one of the things that you really see is that this book really is about locating political prisoners within the larger institutions in which they're incarcerated, but also the political intellectual life that they belong to. When you take someone and incarcerate them, it's just not them. What happens to the people left behind? What happens to the families? What does it mean to wait for bail for 4 years? What are the ways in which the institution is cruel? And what we really wanted to do is not just talk about political prisoners as these great martyrs and heroes, which they are, but also the fact that there is an entire community around them, that one is completely destroyed, that has to rebuild, that continues to fight. And in some ways, we had to tell that story that was important in a way for us to understand. You have to understand that when some of these prisoners were arrested, they left behind young children. Some of them haven't seen their parents. There are parents waiting to have not seen their kids. Pandu Narote, who was arrested, was an Adivasi man who died of swine flu in the prison, never saw his family after the day he was arrested. So one of the things that we really wanted to do is that take as many of these people as we tell their stories and place them within the context, the histories of resistance, the intellectual histories, the letters that they write, the families that they come in, but also locate them within, because India is so vast, is that history and memory is so local that we have to locate them within their own histories of resistance. And I think that's what we really try to do. And we try to do it through the voices of these communities, through prison writings, through material objects that were important to them. So this is not just a book that is reported, but it also is a book that kind of gives us various aspects of it. The other thing that we did in the book was actually to give a list of every single person arrested under these terror laws since Modi came to power. And that kind of gives them the name, the laws that they were arrested under, and the number of days spent in prison, which in some ways for me is a far more cold list. Lists are very powerful ways of telling us what's happening. So this book in some ways defies form because it has multiple kinds of materials that come together to tell the story.
That's really amazing. And I think it's so important to be shedding light on the stories of specific individuals who are, and the way this has impacted their lives and the lives of their loved ones. And all that said, the purpose of political prisoners or of imprisoning people for dissenting is to make an example of them, right? To shut other people up, to say, this is what will happen to you if you do what this person did, if you speak out against what we're doing, against our policies, whatever it is you're speaking out against. And in this case, I'm just curious, has it worked to chill people from, has it had a chilling effect? My apologies. Has it had a chilling effect on dissent in India, the fact that people haven't been imprisoned under these laws and what they've had to endure as a result?
Yes, there is a chilling effect and there is fear, but the defiance and the resistance hasn't gone away. One of the things that we were able to do in this book is that the book, by the time the India edition of the book came out, some of the political prisoners did get bail and they had come out. Every single one of them, when they came out, was smiling. They were raising slogans, they were smiling, they were talking about the work that had to be done. Even those in prison, when they were in prison, many of them were trying to help the other prisoners. They were trying to write letters. They were trying to help the others figure out things. What you really see is that these are some of India's most thoughtful activists, writers, lawyers. Their entire life is building community and making sure that the communities that they fight for can continue to resist against the state violations. So what you see is that the resistance exists. And yes, there is a chilling effect, that is fear. But imagine every single one of them coming out of prison smiling, raising slogans. And I think it's the state that is scared. The ongoing resistance in India has not gone away. It has gotten worse. I think they've made it incredibly difficult. The oppression has gone up. The repression has gone with Modi's third regime. I do believe that things will get worse, but I don't think the resistance is there. The resistance to challenge the state is there, and the people's movement in like all parts of the world is doing what they do, which is consistently resist the state and keep working towards it every day.
No, I think that's very true. And certainly the work you all do at the Polis Project makes that very clear. I hope people are following it regularly. And, one thing I wanted to just say, the book is dedicated to all those who fight for freedom. And I love that dedication. But I wanted you to speak about that because obviously, the situation in India in and of itself stands alone, and it's interesting and relevant from that point of view. But it seems that for really anyone around the world involved with popular movements, that this has a particular resonance.
Absolutely. I think that we have to understand that incarcerations, authoritarian regimes learn from each other. As I said, so much of what we see in India was borrowed from the Patriot Act. Again, India learns quite extensively from what Israel does. Just as we have Cop City here, where you have the exchange of knowledge between NYPD and cops in Atlanta and Chicago and cops in Israel, we are having the same thing being replicated in India. And what you're really seeing is these regimes of repression replicate around the world. And fighting for freedom, and I think what really resonates with this book is that as I am a grandchild of a formerly colonized, when my grandfather was alive, he was not a subject of an independent nation. He was a subject of a colony. My grandfather himself was a political prisoner. So in my lifetime, I have seen someone who was colonized. So for us, I think it's not just about what's happening in India. The idea that occupied people around the world have the right to liberation and fighting for it. And I think that is something that is inherent in the book. That is something that is inherent in all colonized people. And I think we have to continue to learn from each other, as I said, we have political prisoners in the United States. We have political prisoners in Israel. State repression is state repression across the world. And I think there is so much for all of us to learn from each other.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that is very well put, very poignant. I believe here in the United States, folks should go to Pluto Press to get the book. Is that correct? Okay, I got it. I actually know that. I have it up in front of me. You get a free ebook if you also buy the paperback. So just throwing that out there for folks. But Suchitra, as always, really appreciate you joining us. How Long Can the Moon Be Caged? Voices of Indian Political Prisoners is the book. Hope everyone is following the Polis Project. And as always, thanks for giving us some of your time here on the Freedom Side.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Eugene, we're making our way around the world.
We are. No, and it's a really interesting text. I hope people pick it up. There's poetry in there. There's stories. There's information. And it's, there's obviously a very big effort in the United States to whitewash what's happening in India. There's a lot of very active individuals, including in the U.S. Congress, even some who claim they care about the issues in India, who have gone a long way to put the BJP up on a pedestal there in Mr. Modi's government, some sort of, democratic ally of the United States. And I think this punctures it, but also gets to the fact that it's not just the BJP, it's others, and it has a long history, and a very interesting, very important question. And, as someone who's looked a lot into this myself, there are a lot of ties, between the movements in India, historically liberation movements, and the movements here in the United States, especially in the African-American community. And I think that there's so many different other relevant and important things. And also, vis-a-vis anything, I mean, Suchitra had a kafio, and I didn't comment on that, but, worth noting that, the BJP government is one of the number one supporters of Israel. And a lot of these rich oligarchs, in India, Adani Group and all these other people, have very close relationships with India. They're basically in Kashmir, trying to do sort of an Israel option. They have sort of a settler colonial attitude to what they're trying to do there in Kashmir. So, a lot of different relevant and important ties on a number of different fronts between the struggles of these people. But even beyond that, it stands alone. I mean, obviously, our good friends at NewsClick, especially Prabir, were have been targeted in that regard, and there are so many others. Umar Khalid, I think, has just passed a very high milestone of time. I think he's been in since 2020. So, nonetheless, it's dozens and dozens of people, but they're continuing to fight. So, really important issue and a lot of good connections around the world. But as we're talking about state violence, Rania, I want to move to our next story. That's the killing of Sonia Massey, by the police here in the United States. And to talk more about that, we are very, very honored to be joined here by Mr. Sean Blackman, my former co-host of a great show by any means necessary, and current co-host of Darker Than Blue, which airs live on WPFW 89.3 FM Jazz and Justice Radio in Washington, D.C. Sean Blackman, thank you for being with us, sir.
Eugene, Rania, always a pleasure.
Well, the pleasure is all ours. I wish we had a better topic to discuss here. We're something that you and I have talked about so often, over the years that we've known each other, this epidemic of police terrorism in the United States. I guess before we actually get into the specifics, maybe just tell us a little bit at least what happened in this case, because I feel there's so much going on in the world. I think a lot of people actually might have missed this one because of everything happening.
Yeah, for sure. Well, when we talk about the racist police killing of Sonia Massey, this is an incident that took place back on July 6th, earlier this month. And Sonia Massey was killed by a Sangamon County, Illinois sheriff's deputy after she actually called the police asking for assistance because she thought that there was an intruder, someone trying to come into their home. So when the sheriffs arrived at Massey's house, they didn't find anyone outside. They didn't see any intruder. So they went inside the house to have a look around and doing that sort of thing. Didn't see anyone in the house. And so then they began just shouting orders at Sonia Massey, which of course immediately escalated the situation. Now, even though Massey complied with all of the officers' instructions, she made a comment to them saying, "I rebuke you in the name of Jesus," after she was instructed to remove a pot of water from the stove. And so after she said these words, the deputy, Sean Grayson, pulled out his weapon, shouted at Massey, made threats to her that he would shoot her in the face. And so Massey set the pot down immediately, all of that, went to kneel down on the ground as one would do with her hands up. And even though Massey had her hands up, there was no pot in her hand, no weapon or anything like that, Grayson continued to shout at her repeatedly and told her to drop the effing pot while shooting her multiple times while she was already on the ground. And this puts Sonia Massey in, frankly, a dark and sad tradition of Black women who have been killed in their homes by police. I mean, people like Charlene Lyles, Tatiana Jefferson, Breonna Taylor, Eleanor Bumpers. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And another thing that's important to note about this is the record of Sean Grayson, who was the 30-year-old officer who killed Sonia Massey. This is someone who worked 3 full-time jobs and also 3 part-time jobs in 4 police departments and 2 sheriff's offices over the past 4 years, all within the state of Illinois. And I don't think a lot of people really recognize how often these kinds of brutal cops and killer cops are sort of moved around the state. Sometimes they go to different states, get jobs at different police departments. Some of them even start security companies and things like that. And beyond that, court records show that Grayson himself was charged with 2 DUIs in Macoupin County, which is also in Illinois, 2 years in a row. Now, we're told in this society that police are these, highly trained, highly professional, highly skilled crusaders for justice. But in reality, there's such incompetence in the system that someone like Grayson, who should have never been in any position of law enforcement, and certainly not with a weapon, this is what allows people like this to not only be in police departments, but it also puts people like Sonia Massey directly in their sights. And so, this is not only another tragic incident of racist police killing, it just goes to show how this issue of racist police terror has not abated.
I mean, it really does. It's such a shocking incident, but also all too common, Sean, like you mentioned. This is one of over 700 people in the United States killed by police this year already. That's one of the highest numbers since apparently 2013. So, this is following repeated bouts of mass protests across the country over the last decade that we've seen when it comes to police violence under different administrations from different parties. Yet nothing seems to change. I remember the last presidential election. We heard a lot from the Republicans about Democrats trying to defund the police. But what has actually happened since there's been a Democratic president in office. Has anything changed in the policing apparatus in the United States, for better or for worse?
Yeah, the whole defund the police movement was it's kind of hard to know how to describe it, because the way it played out and the way it portrayed what was pretty fake, because the narrative that we were given is that, oh, well, all the Democrat run cities defunded the police, and then crime shot through the roofs. And so that was shown to be a foolish move. And this was used to justify mass investment and mass hiring in police forces all across the country. But this simply never really happened. I mean, I live here in Washington, D.C., where we live under a so-called progressive mayor, Muriel Bowser, the same one who wrote Black Lives Matter on the street in front of the White House, but has, facilitated and gone along with the police on every single instance of police killing that has happened under her tenure, of which there are more than a few. And so we see that the police in this country were not only not defunded, but the whole idea of taking money from these massive police budgets that we see across the country and actually putting it towards something that actually sustains human life, this was ruthlessly attacked. Even Barack Obama was called in to attack this idea. And he had the audacity to basically say that, defund the police was empty phrase mongering. Now, this is the cat who rode into the White House talking about hope and change we can believe in. Now, that was empty phrase mongering, because what we got was bank bailouts. He refused to codify Roe into law. Libya was toppled into a failed state. Its leader, Gaddafi, murdered in the street. And so, it's just clear that that wing of the ruling class sort of pretended to make a gesture towards, some kind of real police reform. But since the police are armed bodies of the state, and since that they are in place to protect the interests and the property of the wealthy of the ruling class, they can never be reined in under this capitalist system, because they are in fact the soldiers of capital. This is why they are allowed to brutalize and kill people and get away with it, because police are crucial to protecting the capitalist system itself. And so, we saw Joe Biden and Kamala Harris opportunistically sort of, jump on this whole issue with Sonia Massey to push the George Floyd Policing Act, which actually has some positive things in it. It's supposed to, get rid of no-knock warrants, get rid of qualified immunity, which basically would take away the kind of ironclad legal protections that police often have in things like this. But particularly with Kamala Harris, who literally dubbed herself the top cop of California once upon a time, and not so very long ago, I think it's very cynical to see her or Joe Biden, who promised however many thousands of police on the street, and also was a strong proponent of funding the police. Joe didn't even pretend to care about defunding. You know what I mean? And so particularly as we get closer to the U.S. elections in the United States, and I feel like I have to say, it's kind of strange for me as someone who has organized against racist police terror to see people who have been in similar spaces and saying similar things, and who will talk to you all day about the issues with the police, but now seemingly can't wait to vote for a cop in November. It's just sort of a strange political moment that we're in the United States. But what everyone needs to be clear on is that the real solution to racist police terror in this country does not rest with the Democratic Party. It doesn't rest with any of these ruling class parties under this system. It rests within the social movements. And this officer that killed Sonia Massey, Sean Grayson, he has been charged with murder. And I would argue the only reason that Grayson was even charged with murder is the same reason that Derek Chauvin was charged with the killing of George Floyd back in 2020. Not because all of a sudden the state realized that cops shouldn't be able to kill people with impunity, but because of the pressure that was applied by the movement. And we're going to have to keep applying that pressure if we're going to see an end to racist police terror once and for all.
No, I think that's an important point. And, vis-a-vis what you said about Kamala Harris, Gary Tan, who is the CEO of Y Combinator, which is like a big startup incubator, and, he's a major pusher of law and order policies. He actually said on Twitter, he hasn't openly endorsed Kamala yet, but he said top cop Kamala Harris can win. And then he excerpted out a statement that she'd made about how she's supported severe punishments for certain crimes. So, I mean, it kind of gives you a sense of like the people who are the super pro law and order people spending, hundreds of millions of dollars to change the politics of San Francisco think that she's great because she's quote unquote tough on crime, whatever that means, is notable. Yep. But one thing I wanted to ask you, Sean, obviously President Trump was there yesterday at the National Association of Black Journalists meeting, and the Sonia Massey case came up. He said he didn't know that much about it, but that he didn't like it, nonetheless, what he saw. But beyond him just obviously trying to, curry some favor there by not seeming like he was for it, he said something I thought was interesting. He said, sometimes very bad decisions are made, but they're not made from an evil standpoint. And that rubbed a lot of people the wrong way for obvious reasons, because clearly, a huge motivator in just taking someone's life is obviously going to be, oftentimes racism, prejudice, whatever. And in the case of this officer, he seems like he was totally off the chain. But I also think this speaks to an important aspect of what's going on, Sean, and you've seen this so many times. People say, oh, it's just a mistake. As if the sort of individual element of this is the most important factor rather than the structural element, which is why we see this happening so many times. So I was hoping you could speak to that, because, and not that I think a lot of these things are mistakes, but even insofar as something is a mistake and someone dies, it's not as if that is then like forgivable. Like with the Amber Geiger thing, everyone's like, oh, she was mistaken. Whether or not she was didn't make it right.
Right. And first, I just got to say, I went to journalism school at an HBCU, of course, Florida A&M University. And I just remember NABJ just being pushed so hard as something that we had to be a part of and had to be involved in, and that it was basically our duty. And, they had all these fun little conferences and stuff that they had. And it was made to seem as though, as aspiring young Black journalists, this is what we should do. And so to see the NABJ invite Trump and announce it at like 9:00 on a Monday, almost as if to try to stave off the worst of the backlash that they knew it would come, I think is unfortunate to say the very least. But to answer your question, Eugene, it actually takes me back to Derek Chauvin, because if people remember, during the Derek Chauvin trial, really the state went out of its way to paint Chauvin as a rogue actor, as an officer who went against all the good training that he was given, and that his killing of George Floyd somehow violated what a police officer should do. When, of course, we know it is the very nature of the police in this country to do what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd, and to do what Sean Grayson did to Sonia Massey. And see, the reason this happens is because if you individualize the officer, if you say, oh, well, this person made a mistake, oh, well, that person was just, just went rogue on that day. What that does is it takes the attention away from the systemic root of racist police terror. It puts people in a sort of mind frame of, well, it's just this person that quote unquote made a mistake or did the wrong thing, but nothing this individual does should reflect on the police institution. The police as an institution cannot be questioned precisely because of what I mentioned earlier, because it is so important to the maintenance of the capitalist system. And so this individualizing of officers in these cases of police terror, in reality, is just another way of protecting the police as an institution and protecting the capitalist system that they are in place to serve. And this is why in all of the discussion, all of the legislation and things like that, and talk of police reforms that we hear, we never really talk about the root of the police as an institution. The fact that they come out of slavery, and that to this very day, in the 21st century, they basically do the very same thing. Ain't nothing changed but the technology.
Well, Sean, I think that's 100% correct. I mean, it's funny how obvious some of this seems when you lay it out like that, but how somehow it's never presented that way in the mainstream media. And obviously, we'll continue to have to see what happens here. I know the officer, or at least, the head of the sheriff's department is claiming they're going to look into it and do something and take him off, but you never really know. Either way, Sean Blackman, host of Darker Than Blue, which you can catch on WPFW 89.3 FM, Jazz and Justice Radio. If you're in DC, turn it on your dial, but if you are not, you can check it out at the WPFW website as well, where everything streams. Sean, thank you so much for giving us some of your time here in the Freedom Side.
Eugene, Rania, thanks as always.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was a really good breakdown by Sean, who I just had the pleasure of seeing in Venezuela. He was observing the elections there. That was crazy. Venezuela was crazy.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, Rania, because you were there in Venezuela last week during the pre-election period and the election itself, and a little bit in the post-election period as well. And I'm sure you'll have much to say about this across a number of different fronts over the coming days. You've already said some on social media. Hopefully people have seen some of your commentary there as well. But I guess I just wanted to offer you if there's an opportunity, really, I guess, to just speak to what you think is relevant in terms of what people saw. Obviously, there's so many different issues, the back and forth over, the electoral count and all these different pieces, and a lot to get into. But maybe just some of your initial thoughts having been there on the ground.
Well, I have a lot to say, but first I want to note that I went to Venezuela from Lebanon, where I live, and it's just to go from one place where you see the impact of U.S. imperialism to another place where you see it in a bit of a different way was pretty jarring for me, in the sense that, Venezuela is a country that has suffered for years and years and years under horrific U.S. economic warfare, in addition to repeated attempts at coups against the government in Venezuela, the elected government in Venezuela. There was actually a Washington Post piece that came out last week that was about U.S. sanctions around the world, and it admitted it was basically like a confession in the piece, said that because of U.S. sanctions, the Venezuelan economy contracted 3 times worse than what we saw happen in the U.S. because of the Great Depression. So we learn about the Great Depression as being this like apocalyptic economic collapse that caused, such suffering and horrors across the U.S. in the 1930s. 3 times as bad as that in Venezuela, man-made, because of U.S. sanctions. That's not me saying it. That's the Washington Post. So all that's to say, this is a country that's been reeling from the impact of U.S. warfare. And so they had elections. They have a popular government that was reelected with President Nicolás Maduro in one of the most transparent, if not the most transparent process to take place around the world. Why is it so transparent in Venezuela? Because Venezuela is under a microscope, because every time it has elections, the U.S. calls them fraudulent and refuses to accept the results. And we saw months before this election, the U.S. government officials and local right-wing opposition who are allied with the U.S. and have participated in coups in the past say they would refuse to recognize the results if they lost. If Maduro wins, they are already calling it fraudulent before the elections have taken place and will refuse to recognize the results. So I was very happy that I was going to get the opportunity to go report from Venezuela during these elections, because I wanted to see for myself, first of all, how transparent is this process that international observers have repeatedly called so great, including former President Jimmy Carter himself, has repeatedly called these elections so great and wonderful and better, in fact, more transparent and easier than what we see in the U.S. And what I saw, I visited a few polling places on election day. I saw a very transparent process where people, international observers, and by the way, the opposition, had access to witnessing this take place. Even people who voted for the opposition, who I spoke to on camera, were talking about the ease with which they were able to vote, how quick it was. It was way more organized than anything I've ever seen in the United States. I'll say that much. That said, and the results, by the way, came out just a few hours after polls closed. And in addition, as the polls were closing, Eugene, there was a few polling stations, including one where our own correspondent, Luis, who people should still be following, by the way, he's still on the ground in Caracas, witnessed hundreds of members or activists of the opposition coming and trying to shut down the polls before voting was over. and demanding the polls shut down. So that's the kind of opposition we're talking about, one that is allied with the United States and was trying to prevent people from voting while also complaining that there's fraud. Anyway, there was an election between Nicolás Maduro and 9 other people. There was 10 candidates on the ballot, more than we get in the U.S. But of course, the most important candidate was the opposition was Edmundo Gonzalez, who ended up winning something like 44% of the vote, which isn't nothing, by the way. But really, he's not a very well-known figure. It was this woman, Maria Corina Machado, who was banned from running, and the U.S. whines that she's banned from running because Venezuela is an authoritarian dictatorship, but actually she was banned from running because she's participated in several violent coup attempts against the Venezuelan government. I mean, you could imagine, Eugene, what would happen if somebody in the U.S. participated in several violent coup attempts against the elected government of the United States. They probably wouldn't be walking around free. I imagine the punishment would be worse than just banning them from running for president. So anyways, this woman you see on screen right now, Maria Corina Machado, she wasn't running officially, but she was kind of the unofficial person running. She's the popular one. The man standing next to her is this older sort of Biden-like figure who is older and just kind of a bit incoherent, and people don't really know who he is. And anyways, they won a pretty, I mean, I would say 44% though isn't nothing. They did win votes, but they didn't win the election. Maduro won the election. He got like 52%. I'm sorry if I'm fumbling those numbers, but he got over 50% of the vote. He won fair and square in this very transparent process. Over 800 people, international election observers, came to witness these elections. The National Lawyers Guild, included among those people, actually wrote up a report afterwards saying they were very transparent. They saw no evidence of fraud. That said, as soon as it was clear that Maduro won, which was expected, by the way, you saw the entire regime change apparatus go kick into gear. The opposition, I mean, Maria Corina Machado went on national television and refused to accept the results, and actually insanely claimed that it was the opposition that really won, and they won every single state in Venezuela, and that they won 70% of the vote. That's what they're claiming. It's actually insane to even be claiming something as ridiculous as we won every single state. I mean, if you're going to lie about winning, at least make it believable. And also their numbers make no sense. There's people who can speak to that better than I can. You saw, I mean, one thing that was really striking for me, Eugene, was to just see the way that the media in the US covered all this as I was on the ground to see it. But more importantly, the next day after this election happened, you saw right-wing mobs take to the streets, carrying out acts of violence, beating people up, burning. I mean, they burnt down a hospital. They burnt down a municipal building in Lara State, like just on and on and on. Just, I actually saw them with my own eyes. You know, we were driving in the street and actually had to turn our car around because there was a mob of like dozens and dozens of angry masked men with sticks who looked like they were out for blood. And, you know, they were preventing people from going to the airport. Lots of people ended up missing their flights. It was pretty chaotic the day afterwards. And these, of course, are what are called the guarimbas of, like, these are just like these right-wing sort of mob groups who are just carrying out acts of like violence and you know, they're basically just a bunch of fascists who are aligned with the right-wing opposition that's aligned with the U.S. And this seemed really well organized. A few hours after that, the Venezuelan government came out itself and said this was an official coup attempt. They blamed the U.S. for it. You saw U.S. officials kind of backing it rhetorically, saying that the Maduro didn't actually win. The opposition doubling down, Maduro didn't actually win. And then trying to get like other regional leaders to agree with that. And the right-wing ones did. I'm sure you saw what the Argentinian president Javier Milei was saying. You saw Elon Musk suddenly jump into this. And he's been like tweeting nonstop, saying Maduro's dumber than a donkey, that he's not the president of Venezuela. Actually, this right-wing opposition candidate is. I mean, it's just completely insane, Eugene. I mean, I could go on, and I'm just going to keep rambling if you don't stop me. But it was completely insane what I saw, and then also just to see the juxtaposition with the New York Times. It's like you see the right-wing vigilantes on the ground carrying out acts of violence, and then what do you see in the New York Times and on CNN? That actually the popular will of the Venezuelan people people's being denied, and that the opposition actually did win, and that these people in the streets who are carrying out acts of violence are actually protesters just demanding that the people they voted for be recognized. And then the day following that, you saw these massive crowds of Chavistas come out to defend the government that they elected to power, that won a majority of the vote. And then this is still playing out now. I think it's been a bit calmer in the streets of Venezuela since yesterday. And there's been rallies of just like masses and masses of people from popular movements across Venezuela who support their country's sovereignty and their elected government, having to once again take on the U.S. And you also see the U.S. starting to use rhetoric that's starting to look pretty similar to what they did with Juan Guaido, where they're refusing to recognize Maduro as the leader. And it seems that they want to recognize this other guy who didn't win, in that way of like kind of recognizing a parallel government that hasn't actually been elected to power. I mean, we've already seen the same script play out. It's just ridiculous to watch. And just the violence and the nastiness on the ground, it makes you very angry at imperialism.
Yeah. Well, we'll have to see what happens now. The issue is moving into a new stage. President Maduro has introduced a case into the Supreme Court of Venezuela to sort of adjudicate this issue. Ultimately, that means that all the different sides are going to have to present all of their evidence. And, allegedly, Maria Corina Machado and the opposition, they claim it's actually a little unclear what they're claiming, and I think it's being reported in ways that are not entirely clear. But they at least claim to have obtained a significant number of what are known as actas, the records, the paper records from enough polls to show that they won. But they have not revealed this to anyone except a handful of different reporters. The New York Times article was based on what they said was information they were able to see, partial information, but they themselves said they could not corroborate that information. There are a number of people on social media who are posting what are alleged to be actas, saying the same thing about the opposition. So there's a lot of information that's floating around out here about these records, these paper records from the roughly 28,000 voting precincts. But I think it's important for people to recognize and to understand that not only has none of this been verified, but everything that's being reported about it is being reported in sort of weird elliptical ways. What percentage do they have? Is it a projection or is it specific? So we actually don't know if what is being said has any real validity, but it's being reported by the New York Times, by El País, and by others as having complete validity. But nonetheless, President Maduro has said that he will present 100% of what they have. The Electoral Commission is stating that they have been under cyber attack. That's why they have not been able to post this information. But they say that they will post this information. Now it will all be before the Supreme Court. We'll have to see how that all plays out. But it seems that from a factual basis here, we will be able to see one way or another what's going on. But I do want to note that, as you pointed out, Mundo Gonzalez got 44%. The other opposition candidates got something like, I think, 4% odds. So it's about 48%. So I think 52, 53 to 48, which hews very closely to Interlace's exit poll. And Interlaces is considered historically to be one of the most credible Venezuelan pollsters, and that's being totally whited out in terms of what people are talking about in the context of the aftermath of the vote. So I think that there's a lot to be seen here, and I think it's notable, and we'll have to look at what the details are. But I think the most important factor is the one that you laid out there about the protest, the violent protest, the Garimbas, which have a number of a long history in Venezuela, burning black people because black people are supposedly Chavistas, decapitating people basically, or attempting to decapitate people by motorcyclists by putting, wire across the roads, burning different things, popular pharmacies, hospitals, destroying recently refurbished bus stations. And also there's the long history of the fact that this is a right-wing authoritarian regime. They've called for coups. They've called for foreign intervention. As you said, they have never, they said before the vote that if they lost, that it was totally fraudulent. So it gives you a sense of where they were at from the very beginning. So it's, democracy as it suits them, not as it maybe speaks to democracy in a small d sense. So important factor, a lot to be said there. I'm sure you'll be saying more and doing more and bringing us more. And I think the point that you also made on your social media is very relevant to our current times about how Maria Corina Machado is so tied to Israel and very close to Likud and wants to, she said if she was president, she would move the embassy to Jerusalem and so on and so forth. So a lot of different threads to pull, a lot of different things to discuss here, and we will keep reporting on it for you there from the ground. We have Luis, who has been there and is there, and we'll have more coming forward, and we'll have more commentary as we continue to learn more and as these exact issues are adjudicated vis-a-vis the exact data as it becomes available to us as it concerns the election. We will update you on that. But I think, Rania, that will bring us to the end of the show here today. It's great to be back alongside you. Great show as always. Thanks to all of our guests and all of our viewers. But before we go, Rania, what would you like to leave our viewers with?
Well, I would like to remind our viewers that if they haven't already, make sure you smash that like button.
That like button.
Like, I love that so much. But more importantly, we are, especially post-Venezuela election, as we witness this attempted, so far failed coup attempt, and the way the media is covering it, as we have witnessed for almost 10 months now, this ongoing genocide in Gaza and Israel's insistence on essentially expanding that to the entire region. I think we've learned how important independent media is, how important media that is not tied to a corporate war machine is in moments like these. And so Breakthrough News, I am very privileged to be a part of Breakthrough News, an independent media outlet that is bringing you the reality of the ground and the capacity that we are able to. We want to keep doing that. We want to keep growing so that we can keep providing you with the news and informing you about what's actually happening in the world. So on that note, please do become a part of this independent media project and go to patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Become a member of Breakthrough News. You can access perks, really cool merch, as well as various content, including parts of my show Dispatches that are available only to members. But most importantly, you can help us sustain ourselves as an independent media outlet and continue to grow. So patreon.com/Breakthrough News. Become a part of the independent media movement. It really is, I think, one of the most important things you can do in this moment, beyond being in the streets.
Yes, absolutely. Well, very well said. And of course, once again, thanks to all our guests. Thanks to all of you who viewed. Thanks to all of our existing patrons. Big shout out to everybody watching us on Free Speech TV. That'll do it for us here on the Freedom Side this week. For myself, for Rania, for Breakthrough, as always, we will see you next time.